can do with that information to improve their lives. I got into it kind of in a circumventual way. As I said, I was an entrepreneur for many years, excuse me. And I kind of let the life get the better of me. I was always operating with a highly active nervous system, always perceiving threat. And a lot of that was because of how I grew up, the upbringing that I had, moving so much, and just kind of my relationship with my parents. I was disciplined a lot. And so I was always trying to prove myself. It was never enough. And so I grew up that way, moved into adulthood that way, and I have a lot of addiction in my family. So I ended up coping with a lot of these mental patterns that were uncomfortable: anxiety, some levels of depression, a highly active nervous system, always stressed out, always defensive, quick to anger. Ended up coping with that with drugs and alcohol, and it eventually brought me down. At the age of 52, I hit a hard bottom and ended up in rehab. And I just remember that moment as like it was yesterday, and just thinking to myself, how did I end up here and what's become of me? And so at that moment, I had some serious look in the mirror, reflecting to do, and decide if I was going to give it another try to figure out how to live life the right way. And I fortunately took one day at a time and summoned the wherewithal and the willpower and the commitment and energy to do so. And, I've put my life back together. And in this process, I've learned a whole lot about the brain, because that's where it all kind of starts and ends, whether it's with addiction or any other mental patterns that are uncomfortable and unhelpful, or just, all of who we are is mapped out in our brains. And so I had to dive deep into my own brain and understand how it had ended up the way it had and what I was going to do about it, because clearly the way I had been living my life and the way I had mapped my brain wasn't helpful. And so that's what I've spent the last 12 years doing, is figuring all that out. And it's become so meaningful and transformative in my own life that I thought it would be a shame if I didn't share this with anyone else, just because it's just such a gift. And so that's what I decided a few years ago to do, was to leave what I consider the entrepreneurial world, where you're, producing goods and services or whatever it might be. And just really looked at this as trying to help people navigate their own worlds, give them an understanding of how their brains work and what they can do to actually make positive changes. Because that, our brain is just so remarkable. It's willing to do whatever we ask it to do, but it just takes us to intervene and to guide and direct it. So with that, I'll stop. I know I've rambled a little bit, but that's kind of how I got here.
So addiction is a thing that affects pretty much everybody. If pretty much everybody knows somebody that has some form of addiction, whether it's, drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, food, shopping, hoarding. I mean, these are all, and among many other addictions, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of addictions, and it affects people every day. And, one of the problems that a lot of people face is they don't understand addiction. They think they know the addiction because they live with somebody that maybe is. They don't understand addiction. They live with somebody they think they know about addiction because they live with them, but they don't understand the mental capacity of addiction. And it can hurt. The addictions can not only hurt the individual that has the addiction, but also their family and friends and their livelihood and everything else. And as somebody that has many people in my family and many people in my life that have suffered from addiction and died from addiction, that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast, was because somebody that I was close with growing up had a serious drinking problem and then got into hard drugs and eventually passed away. And I looked myself in the mirror and said, it's time to start getting the word out and do what I want to do, because life is short. So, addiction motivates people in many different ways. Now, you're talking about the brain performance. This is kind of interesting. You want to tell me a little bit about that and enlighten me on like the stuff in the brain that you've learned about addiction and stuff?
Yeah, well, clearly, when you're addicted and have those patterns that you've developed, because that's really what they are, they're patterns in the brain that we've, developed and employed to cope with some underlying difficult mental experience that we're having. That's generally how it develops. Or there's some genetic predisposition to it, like I had in my family, where the actual reward network in the brain, the parts of the brain involved in, identifying and seeking and getting reward for experiences is not developed properly or is malfunctioning. And so, brain performance is more of a big umbrella around, our mental performance is exists on as broad a spectrum as our physical performance does. So we all know times in our life where we've been in our best shape and our worst shape and everywhere in between. We clearly understand that there's this broad range of physical performance that we can attain or not attain based on, what we put into it. The same exists for our brains, but we don't realize that. We just think that what's up there is what it is, and there's nothing we can do about it, and nothing could be further from the truth. And so that's really where I come at this, is not just from addiction, because addiction is obviously deleterious to brain performance. But it's just this overarching, idea around, let's understand our brains better, how it works. Because I'll tell you that very few people understand how their brains work. And it's the thing that runs everything in our lives. It weighs 2 pounds, but it runs everything, including all of our other organs. And it consumes 25% of our energy. We understand more about, every other part of our body than we do our brain. And so it's interesting because people seem to think, well, if I need to know more about my brain, or when I begin to look into it or feel like I need to, then that means something's wrong with me or I need to be fixed. And that's not the case at all. It's just that we have this broad range of performance that we can achieve. So why wouldn't we, when it's the one thing that's going to determine our success more than anything else in our life, why wouldn't we want to look into it and run that through training regimens, just like we would our bodies if we were an athlete? As a matter of fact, most of the athletes we know go through mental training because, I was watching the golf tournament this weekend, and, there's the greatest golfer in the world, Scotty Scheffler. What separates him from every other great golfer that he was competing against is his mind. It's that he can control his brain in the most pressurized moments better than anyone else can. All these guys have very, very similar physical skills, but he just has this ability to control his brain. So anyway, there's just so much to that. We can expand our intelligence, and intelligence is not just, how book smart we are. That's a very narrow slice of what intelligence is. Intelligence is made up of actually 16 different intelligence sections or skills or functions in the brain. We can expand.
I never knew that. 16?
Yep, 16.